represented them for 7 years. I've been in touch with the executives. They've given me all the information related to the questions that came up last week, and so.
What would you like to share with us today that we didn't know last week when I asked some questions then?
Well, let's start by saying, first of all, I do want to reiterate that L1 regrets the inconveniences to California drivers that have been caused by the delays that Mr. Valverde mentioned. I'm happy to report that we have caught up with the backlog. As of Monday, we were caught up, and we continue to be caught up. And to make matters right for the future, we expanded the capacity by 26% and added redundancy to equipment so that these kinds of delays will not recur. You dwelt a little bit last week, Mr. Chairman, on the issue of damages. And the issue of damages is governed by our contract, and we will negotiate in good faith with the Department of Motor Vehicles over what the appropriate damages are. One of the prerequisites of negotiating in good faith, of course, is to do that on a timely basis without unreasonable delay. The problem's been in place since how long, Mr. Valverde?
Well, we initially had a delay of probably 2 weeks, and
going back to
October 1st.
Okay. October, November, December, January, February, March, April, now into May. So we're 7 months into the problem. Where do the negotiations stand on damages?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as we discussed in the past, we invoked the damages clause in December, and to date we've not honored, or we've not paid any of the invoices pending a reconciliation, one of what those damages are, so that we can incorporate that as part of the consideration of any invoice that we do pay.
Well, let me hand out to committee members and their staff a copy of the liquidated damages clause from Appendix A, page 9 of 11 in the contract with L1. And let me ask the staff to share what we're handing out with you all so you have the same document in front of you. And let me express the concern I have, and that is that as I read it, looking on page 9 of 11, under A.XI.1, introduction, last line of that paragraph says, contractor will be liable for actual damages above liquidated damage payments. So, Mr. Valverde, when we spoke before, I think this issue wasn't entirely clear. There are actual damages that are essentially the out-of-pocket costs of the DMV for having to fix this. And then the concern I've expressed is, so what are the damages, what's the consequence to the million Californians, some of whom may describe their inconvenience as relatively modest. Certainly Ms. Fuller was in that category. Others of whom I know, because they were in touch with my office, had travel plans, employment plans, traffic stops, all of which were more than a minor inconvenience as a result of their lack of a valid photo ID on a timely basis from the state of California. So here's what I think the crux of the problem is, having had the opportunity to spend a little more time on it. The calculation of liquidated damages is on page 10 of 11, and there are 5 bullet points. And as I look at those 5 bullet points, and now I'm going to turn to Mr. Silva, who's with the Ledge Counsel's office, it doesn't look to me like any of the things in the liquidated damages clause, any of those provisions, speak to either lateness in delivery or failure to meet specifications in the driver's license in and of itself. Mr. Silva, is that a fair reading?
It is, yeah. As we look at the various formulas that are put together there for computing liquidated damages, we don't find anything there that's a good fit for the particular breach that's at issue here, which is primarily delays in delivery and also poor quality of driver's licenses.
Okay, and here's the concern I have, as one member of the committee, which is the fundamental job of L1 is to deliver an acceptable product on a timely basis. In this case, L1 has not delivered, by its own admission and by your observation as well, Mr. Valverde. L1 has not delivered an acceptable product, and they haven't delivered the product on a timely basis. So we got a liquidated damages clause that provides us with no real recovery for failure to meet either of the two key expectations of the contractor: adequate product, timely delivery. And so from what I can tell, Mr. Silva, there isn't much we can do with the contract we've got other than pursue actual damages, which is what Mr. Valverde has indicated he's prepared to do.
Yes, I agree with that. Under the contract, you do have the option of pursuing actual damages. As I indicated, there's not a good formula here for computing liquidated damages.
So best case then, Mr. Silva, we've got a remedy for the actual out-of-pocket costs of the Department of Motor Vehicles, but we don't have a remedy for a million Californians to be compensated either directly or by some compensation to the state under the liquidated damages provision.
I agree with that.
Let me just say that's not a very happy outcome. And I guess the question I would ask is, who was responsible at DMV for drafting the contract in that way? Because it gives the contractor basically not an awful lot of incentive on two of the most important parts of a contract, which is to have the right product and to have it on time.
Senator,
who signed off on the contract, Mr. Valverde?
well, we have our legal staff who reviewed the terms and conditions in partnership with the Department of General Services, who ultimately signs off on the contract. But
And do they do that in cooperation with DGS, the Department of General Services?
yes,
And did DGS sign off on the contract as well?
my understanding is they did.
All right. Well, I don't want to belabor the point today, although I have a little more conversation I want to engage in with L1. But I think rather than having the same conversation over and over again, at this point, what's clear to me is we've got a contract that doesn't protect the interests of Californians. And I'd like your legal staff and DGS to sit down with each other and come back and report to this budget subcommittee what they're going to do in the future so that never happens again. And I would also like them and you to report back to us on the potential for renegotiating the liquidated damages clause in this contract so that there is, in fact, some actual consequence for failure to deliver a timely and acceptable product. Is that something you can do?
We can do that.
All right. How much time would you like to do that?
Maybe a month.
Okay. I'm going to say that a month is fine with me, but that when people come back in a month, that needs to be for a real product, not for a we're working on it or gee, that's hard. Okay? Because we've had about a month of that in the last month, and we had too much of that during the previous round of conversations when we got assurances that things were getting better, and in fact they got worse. Mr. Naylor, as to L1, is L1 prepared to renegotiate the contract so that we get a liquidated damages clause that provides some protection for Californians?
I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay. If you could have an answer to that question and could get back to the committee in writing within the next couple of weeks, we'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Because what we've got here is, and now I'm just going to, this is, we've had a conversation about how much oversight the legislature does or doesn't provide. So now I'm going to march in. Absent these liquidated damages clauses providing some protection, do you have any suggestions on what we ought to do about the fact that best case we come out of this with compensation for actual out-of-pocket costs by DMV, but no compensation to a million Californians who found themselves without the product they paid for?
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me just put this in perspective. 5 million Californians almost have received driver's licenses. The average delay over these 7 months was about 15 days. I don't know whether that delay gives Californians a claim under the damages, the actual damages clause. What I know about damages is what I learned in law school, and I think that it's what I would like to do is let the real lawyers hash out what the appropriate damage level is.
Well,
and as for a renegotiation, I don't have an answer to that, but that's the approach I suggest. Is
when somebody promises to deliver a product in 48 hours and then delivers it 3 weeks late on a recurring basis over an extended period of time, that's a pretty significant breach. When somebody promises to deliver a product with whiz-bang technology and as much as 20% of the product is unacceptable, that's a pretty serious breach. So I guess the question, I'm in the absence of some and at this point we're on, I think, round 3 of these conversations. In the absence of some effort on the part of L1 to make things right by California, I see no reason why I shouldn't ask the chair of the Transportation Committee in the Senate to join me in a letter to every single DMV in the United States, outlining the experience we've had here in California and encouraging them to make sure that they have an adequate contract that will protect them if they're confronted with the same kind of problems. I mean, I don't see any other way to get L1's attention but to start to share the California experience with other potential clients. Does that seem unreasonable to you?
Mr. Chairman, believe me, the California experience has been shared across the country, and we obviously did not set out to have these delays. We've done everything in our power to make up for it. We're now on time. We now have a quality product, and we'll just have to go forward.
Let me tell you what we don't have. I remember years ago I had a problem with then Governor Davis's office, and I was pretty hot under the collar. And I picked up the phone and I called 2 people who I'd never met before in his office down in the Horseshoe. And they said, please come right down. And I laid out the problem in 2 separate meetings, said, here's what happened. Here's why I think I have a reason to be angry. And here's what they did. They said, you know what? You're right. We're sorry. And here's the key ingredient. They said, what can we do to make it right? So far, L1, in 3 appearances before this committee, has given no indication that it is prepared to do anything to make things right. And we are expected to believe that we should somehow be happy because L1 is now actually performing to the terms of its contract, which was sort of the expectation when things began. So take a couple of weeks. Please get back to us in writing if you can. If not, then I think you just need to make sure your client understands that the California experience will start to be shared in any way, shape, and form we can so that people are fully apprised, because that seems to be the only way we can get anyone's attention at L1. And then back to Mr. Valverde, if you'd please work with DGS and your own legal staff, both, as I say, to make sure we never have this kind of problem again in other contracts for any goods or services where no liquidated damages for the primary concern about quality of product and delivery. And then let's also have the conversation begun, please, between DMV and L1 about whether or not they're prepared to renegotiate. Senator Fuller, any comments or observations, points of view?
You know, I appreciate the
There we go.
I appreciate the clarity of bringing the contract forward so that we can all look at the existing issues and have a discussion that helps us be informed as to what our options are. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lowenthal?
I'm just surprised, maybe shocked at the contract itself and the lack of liquidated damages.
Okay. On that note, we're going to thank Mr. Silva, who's been both helpful but also very patient today and learned an awful lot about high-speed rail that I'm sure he'll value. And we want to thank you, Mr. Valverde, and you, Mr. Naylor, and let's see if we can't wrestle this to a conclusion, please. Thank you both. Any witnesses on that item? Sorry, I didn't want public testimony? No. All right. Thank you very much. Then let's go back to page 16 of the published agenda. And I believe we're about to take up the Hatchery and Inland Fisheries Fund. Okay, and Mr. LaMalfa has rejoined us, and we thank him for that. And we heard this issue in February. The department was asked to return for some oversight on AB 7. Anything in the way of an initial presentation?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, no, not at this time.
All right. Let's start with the issue of the impact of stocking non-native species or potential impact on native species. Department spent some time evaluating that? Yes?
Yes, we have, through our recent environmental process, evaluate our hatchery operations as they affect native species and streams. Yes, we have.
And your conclusions as a result are?
In some instances, there are impacts to native stocks, and others there aren't. It's dependent on the particular waterway and the conditions in a given waterway.
Well, I guess the question I'm trying to get to is there a concern about crowding out native or heritage fish that in order to reach the quota targets in AB7?
I don't know about as far as crowding out native fish. I think there certainly could be impacts on native stocks from reaching the AB7 goals in some instances, in some areas. However, as required by our environmental document, we've been evaluating individual body waters and streams on a case-by-case basis, and in many cases, we can continue stocking as we have. It's become more a situation of how and where we stock than the volume of stocking.
And let me just add, how do you prioritize funding then for natural and heritage fish as laid out in AB7?
I'm not familiar with how we set our priorities for the natural and heritage fish portion of AB7. I'd be glad to provide that information, though.
All right. Well, let me move to an issue that is part of the staff recommendation. Is you've seen in looking at the materials, the staff's recommended some changes to the budget proposal from the administration, which would reduce slightly the one-time funding per year, but allow both the base funding for the program and the capital outlay projects to be approved. Staff has also recommended budget bill language to restore the timber harvest plan activities that impact fisheries. So maybe at this point it might be timely to say, so how has the general fund reduction thus far impacted the streams and fisheries, the general fund reduction that existed with respect to timber harvest plans?
The general fund reduction has had an impact on our timber harvest plan review program, pretty significant impact, reduced our staffing for that particular program by more than half. And as a result, we focused our timber harvest, we've modified the way we triage timber harvest plan initial review, and we focused our intensive review in the North Coast area, especially as timber harvest could affect streams with listed salmonids.
How does it affect the streams? I think, because I think we're about to have a conversation about timber harvest plans and their connection to fisheries issues, and so I think having a little discussion from you or help from you about what the relationship between the timber harvest plans is and the potential impact on streams and fisheries would be helpful. So if we don't do a good job or we don't do any job at all on timber harvest plans, what bad thing might happen?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of ways that our review, I think, is beneficial as far as protecting streams. Probably the most significant one is road crossings and diversions of waterways that are oftentimes necessary as part of the operation of going in and harvesting timber and removing it from the area. So some of the measures we impose are designed to decrease siltation in the streams, to minimize obstructions in the streams, to ensure that there's adequate shade for temperature control, especially for listed salmonids in the streams. There's several kind of impact point areas that are addressed through our timber harvest plan review program.
All right. Well, once again, the staff has recommended budget bill language that would restore the timber harvest plan activities that impact fisheries, restore the state forest nurseries that support healthy forests and fisheries, and prioritize the remaining $6 million over 2 years for natural and heritage fish production. And there's budget bill language in concept at this point. Why don't we see if there are witnesses on this item, and then let's go to members of the committee. And in addition to members of the committee, Senator LaMalfa, who's been more than patient these last couple of hours. Folks, if you'd like to testify, come on up. We'll make a couple of spaces available for you there. If we can ask the department to just shift over a seat, that'll probably get the job done.
Mr. Chair and members, I'm Luke Bright. I represent an organization called Forest Forever, and I'm also here for Michael Endicott of Sierra Club, California, who could not be here today. First of all, we want to strongly support the staff recommendation of restoring the $1.5 million to the timber harvest review plan, and taking the money from the $10.9 million surplus in the HIF fund. I want to point out that the Department of Fish and Game originally became involved in the review of timber harvest plans submitted to the Department of Forestry. As part of the process, enacted by the legislature in the early 1980s when they developed the California Forest Act, Practice Act. And because the THPs in the timber industry just we're trying to get away from having the full CEQA review, we agreed with them to allow a functional equivalent of the CEQA review process to take place. And so without the participation of DSG in this surrogate process, we believe the CEQA functional equivalent certification is invalid and vulnerable to legal challenge. We recognize that such litigation, if successful, could trigger a moratorium on all THPs approvals by CAL FIRE and create regulatory uncertainty. So I would be happy to answer any of the questions, but as you can tell, I have a little difficulty speaking because of a stroke I had a couple of years ago, but this issue is really important to us. We believe that if the THP process is going to continue as the functional equivalent of CEQA, that DFG has to be involved, not only on the North Coast, but throughout the Sierras and everywhere in California. These THP, the only fish involved come up upstream in the Sierras, and anyway, that's my pitch.
Thank you very much. Next witness.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for having us. My name is Brian Nowicki. I'm here with the Center for Biological Diversity, an environmental organization that works with a lot of endangered species. And we also would like to support strongly the staff recommendation to allocate $1.5 million to restart DFG review of CAL FIRE timber harvest plans. Now, last year's veto of this seemingly small line item has tremendous implications for California's fish, wildlife, and habitat, and the integrity of California's timber harvest program. Without this review, timber harvest programs under CAL FIRE are unable to comply with specific requirements of California Public Resources Code, Forest Practice Rules, and Fish and Game Code that variously require interdisciplinary review of THPs that would include DFG. Restoring funding for review this year on essentially an emergency basis at this point appears to be the absolute minimum necessary to shore up any possibility of considering the THP program as functionally equivalent to CEQA. Longer-term funding options may include collection of fees from timber owners to help pay for the state's costs in developing, reviewing, and approving THPs. But in the absence of this review now, the ultimate alternative would be to overturn or repeal the certification of CEQA functional equivalency, thereby compelling each THP to ensure that appropriate reviews occur on a case-by-case basis. For the immediate budget issue at hand, we support the staff recommendation and ask you to approve this allocation.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, if you could step away and we can get other witnesses up to the table, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Are there any other witnesses on this item? Welcome and thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Senator Samitian and committee members. My name is Brad Willis. I'm here on behalf of SEIU Local 1000. I'm the chair of Bargaining Unit 11, which is the engineering and scientific technicians, which we represent the majority of the hatchery workers. We support the proposal only really because we're really hoping for these capital outlay projects, which are, part of this whole deal. And we're glad to see that some money will be going to hatcheries. However, we do feel that, even though there is a priority for natural and heritage fish production as part of the mandates of AB 7, we also, have other priorities that need to be addressed with the HIF funds, and those would be things like, we have to monitor our water discharge of the hatcheries to make sure that clean water is leaving the hatchery system, invasive species. Our fish health labs are funded through the HIF fund. our broodstock programs as well. So, you know, we really would like to make sure that although we think that, you know, there should be some prioritization of the natural and heritage fish, that the HIF funds are there for production of fish. And, you know, I think some of the questions that you were asking before about fish being, you know, basically fish, hatchery fish being put on top of native species, a big part of our production is the natural and native species. So, you know, we just want to go on record as saying that we support this, but we do have some reservations about it.
Thank you very much.
Right.
All right, members, that brings this item back to the committee. The staff recommendation is contained on page 17. Senator Fuller, comments on this item?
I basically just think that there's a strong nexus between fish permits and replacement of fish taken after you issued the fish permit. In other words, a fishing license really is a permit to take something, and then you want to be able to replace it. And when we get too far beyond that, I believe we are leaving some of the legal statutes that we recently put into play. So that would be my comment.
Thank you. Senator Lowenthal, any comments? And then I'm going to go to Senator LaMalfa.
No comments. I'm waiting to hear from Senator Lamal.
Senator LaMalfa, welcome to Budget Subcommittee number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your graciousness in allowing me to sit in on this particular proposal here. So today I'm probably kind of a dual purpose here in a bill I'm working, SB 505, that we've been working with the SEIU folks, as well as I'll be channeling Senator Dave Cogdill a little bit here.
Good to have him back.
Yeah. Who's worked very, very hard over the years to advance fish stocking policy, and that kind of culminated in AB 7 and when other efforts he had. But AB 7 indeed was a result of much work by him in that area. And so I'm gravely concerned that in this proposal that it's shifting dollars away that are truly dedicated by AB 7 towards building up the fish stocks and meeting the mandate caused by AB 7, which is a 2.75 pound per fishing license granted in the state. Talk about my bill for a moment, SB 505. We're seeking to aid DFG's efforts to reach that goal. As I believe the peak number has been 2.1 pounds in the best year, and 1.9 pounds of that 2.75 goal is more of an average, I think, in the years that this has been a mandate. That's the peak that's been reached. So we're seeking other hatcheries' help to augment that until the fish and game hatcheries are able to spool up a little more and reach that on their own. So that's what the SB 505 is after, and we're getting good interaction and cooperation on that so far in the committee process. But we have to come back to the people involved that are paying for the program of the fishing license, and what is their intent? They're paying $43 each year for that fishing license, and they expect certain things from that indeed the money flows primarily, if not entirely, into the HIF program for hatcheries and the other infrastructure. And now we're seeing that intent, that good faith by those purchasers of fishing licenses is being shifted towards something they would not intend. So when they find that the intent of the legislature may be to do things involved with timber harvest plans instead of the infrastructure and the building up of the fish stocks that they're expecting their licenses to go to, I imagine there's going to be a lot of very upset anglers around the state. And the effects of that alone, we probably don't want to hear about around here, but as well on the sales of fishing licenses, it gets to the point of why bother, which will mean an impact on the funding that flows back into Fish and Game for these very activities. So I'm very concerned that this proposal is wrong-headed in that it shouldn't be funneling money over into the Timber Harvest Plan projects, but staying on track in order to catch up with the infrastructure that's been needed for the fish hatcheries and their operation, and building up the fishing stock that has lagged so far in recent years. So I have to express my concern here today, in conjunction with the bill I'm working, and also with honoring what Senator Cogdill had tried to do. So I was just wanted to register my concerns and opposition to what the recommendation is in this area, and seek the thoughts of others here on the panel and our witnesses today as to why this is justified, indeed, with the spirit of what AB 7 mandated and what fishing license purchasers are expecting out there of the state of Fish and Game, and of what they are going to see when they finally hit the streams. So I thank you for being able to offer this comment.
Thank you, Senator Malfin. I should just mention, certainly in this committee, it's the custom and practice that if any member of the Senate wants to join us for these hearings, they are welcome. The conversation can only be improved, in my judgment, by having more perspective from different members. Here's my take as just one member, and I am prepared to support the staff recommendation. I think I could agree that in a perfect world, that would be a place that none of us get to live and work. We would have a timber harvest plan process in place that did not require this infusion of funding. And that may be about as far as we can all find common ground, because my next observation would be we'd have the funding in place if we charged folks who need timber harvest plans the full cost of providing the THP. But efforts in this committee in years past to increase the fees for a timber harvest plan have not been particularly well received. And of course, ultimately, that's a budget debate that remains unresolved. But absent those funds, absent the fees for timber harvest plans that actually cover the full cost, then we're confronted with the request we have today. And it does raise the issue that, in my judgment, that both Senator Fuller and Senator LaMalfa have raised, which is there an appropriate nexus between the thing that people are paying for, which is their fishing license, and the use of the funds, which in this case is for THPs. And that's why I asked the rather obviously leading question a little bit earlier today. I think there is no doubt that in the absence of careful management of forest resources, and that in the absence of a rigorous and comprehensive THP process, that we end up with streams and creeks and rivers and lakes that are essentially despoiled, and that no longer provide the kind of habitat that is necessary in order to meet the expectations of the people who paid for those licenses. I think it's pretty clear Senator Fuller and Senator LaMalfa have a different point of view on that subject, but I think the fundamental debate here today is an important one. I have been perhaps somewhat more willing to impose fees than Senator Fuller and Senator LaMalfa, if my memory serves me correctly. But I have always been very clear about the fact that if we call it a fee, it ought to be a fee. That if we ask for a tax, then we ought to call it what it is, it's a tax. But if we ask for a fee, there better be a nexus between the thing we're charging the fee for and the ultimate use of the funds. And I think we do not only this body, but the public a disservice if we stray too far. I am, however, convinced that spending these funds on a THP planning activities is, in fact, quite directly related, and that there is a nexus with the fee payer and the end use of the fee. So why don't I see if there are any other comments on this item? Do we have Senator Lowenthal?
I concur with the chair.
All
I
right.
think that the important issue is that nexus. I'm reluctant to go beyond that. I mean, this is really what Sinclair Paint decision has to have, that nexus. I think it's a stretch, but I do think that timber harvest plans that impact, our fisheries is a reasonable one. I think we have to make sure that we don't go too far and expend too much money, and I'm willing to support the chair.
Senator Fuller.
I just want to add one more part to the summary that she provided, and that would be that, from my standpoint, the taxpayer or permittee fee assessed person has an expectation of what their fee is being spent for, and when the reality exceeds the expectation, I think that's when there's a problem. And for me, I'm pretty clear from my area that this would exceed their expectation. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator LaMalfa.
Thank you again. This shouldn't turn into a debate about THPs here so much, but we come back to that it really is an inappropriate usage of these fees, and we can go back and forth if it is the nexus is there or not. Where I come from, I would argue it would be more of a tax because when you look at THPs in California, first I want to establish, is there an emergency situation that requires that we move this way? Timber harvest plans and timber harvest in general in California has been down considerably in the last few years in the down economy and the lesser need for wood products, with nobody building nearly the amount of houses and such as what we've had in recent years. And so then there's the debate on timber harvest plans in California where versus, say, Oregon, where the document is a couple of pages, and in California I think they tend to just weigh the document. If it's heavy enough, then they consider it done. I'm being a little facetious there, but that's how people in the industry feel, that each time you go out to timber harvest, it's like a reinvention of the wheel. And why we can't come up with a template, a program that makes much simpler the timber harvest plan as it is. Again, you're going to be out harvesting in a forest. It might be a particular incline. It might be near a stream. It might not be near a stream. We've been through this for many years with leaving an interval between the stream and the first area you would actually start the harvest, some pretty wide intervals. We've been there on culverts and installing roads, and so the industry has responded. I think the timber harvest plan is, although something that's needed, has gone way beyond what truly is needed in order to preserve the streams from siltation, and the level of risk is much lower than the amount of timber harvest plan that is needed, so, or required, excuse me. So this is really an unfair way of going about this. If we want to have a discussion about the timber harvest plan costs, that should probably be borne on the timber industry, and they come in and fight this issue themselves instead of on the backs of the fishers here. So I'm putting myself a little bit out over a line here because I'm also a strong proponent of the timber industry in the state as well, but it shouldn't be in this particular little box we're working in right now on the backs of the fishermen and their licenses. We have a very specific purpose for these license fees, and it is not for a very onerous and difficult timber harvest plan process. So I have to express that and make that point. And if instead of even looking at how difficult the timber harvest plan process is, maybe we need to really delve into what is it accomplishing with the thickness of the document, the amount of time it takes, and in comparison to other neighboring states or even Canada that have much simpler systems of timber harvest planning. Only a couple pages. Now, maybe we should talk to our friends in Oregon and see, do you have a horrible siltation problem there? You know, just several years ago, it was decided there should be 2 lead agencies on timber harvest plans with a bill, I think it was SB 810 back in 2004 or 5, that wasn't CAL FIRE anymore, or CDF that was the lead. They also brought in the water quality as a co-lead. Well, it's not one-stop shopping anymore to get a timber harvest plan in California. So Bringing it back to this little box here, I think it's really a step in the wrong direction. Inappropriate use, I think the nexus is very, very weak, and indeed looking more like a tax upon fishermen to cover something unrelated to what they do and what the goal should be for all of us that want to see the fish stocks raised up to the level mandated by AB 7 and the direction we're trying to go with my own bill, SB 505. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to express that, and if Dave Cogdill's watching, we're trying, sir. So thank you.
Thank you. DFG, you look like you're hovering over that microphone. Do you want one more word before we call for a vote?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, actually, I just wanted to kind of register that, I'm sure the committee is aware the department receives significant funding from the federal government that are revenues, part of national revenues for fishing and hunting licenses, and there are requirements on how we spend our revenue fees that are attached to those. And I just wanted to, the shift in funding does bring that into light. We haven't discussed this with the Fish and Wildlife Service and our federal partners to see if that does create some kind of problem with the federal funding, but we intend to do so.
And I know we can count on you to make the best possible case for the nexus that we've established here today in committee, if that's the will of the committee.
When will that discussion be had? Because what you're saying is there could be some potential legal issue about the ability to use this, the licenses for timber.
Folks, I do think it's important that we take a look at the actual language that is on page 17, which the proposed language, the following budget bill language, which specifically talks about mitigating the potential adverse impacts of timber operations on the public trust fish and wildlife resources of the state, including but not limited to salmonid fisheries. So the language here specifically, quite narrowly, focuses on the mission of Fish and Game in terms of the use of these funds.
I have no problem with that. It was the director who raised the issue, not me.
Yes, and I'm not raising the issue from the perspective of the department disagreeing with this assessment. I just want to check that box to make sure that we're covered.
Great. And again, the box I want to check is I know you'll give us your best efforts in making that case to the Department of is it Interior?
And I just want to check the box that he gets back to us fairly quickly.
If the issue is raised. All right. Ms. Fuller, would you like us to split these four or just take a vote on all of them together? What's your will?
Yes. The first one, we can take 4 through 7.
No, I'm sorry. Before that, on page 17. Thank you,
right.
Sir. On page 17, there are 4 items, the $1.8 million, the $1.5 million, about which you've raised some concerns, the $500,000, and the $3 million. Would you like to move the $1.8 million, the $500,000, and the $3 million? Or if you'd like to take them all as a single vote them up or down that way. I want to make sure that the vote reflects the members' preferences to the extent that we can do that.
Just separate the capital outlay projects from the rest. If you separate the capital out, so that the capital outlay projects are
those will be
a block,
separate. Those will be a separate.
The others are in a block.
All right. So on page 17, we have a staff recommendation for $1.8 million, $1.5 million, $500,000, and $3 million, as indicated in the published agenda. Do we have a motion to that effect?
I will move all 4 of those.
All right. Call the roll.
Senator Smidian?
Aye.
Senator Fuller?
No.
Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
2-1, that measure passes. Thank you very much. And then before we wrap up, I think we can simply look at items on page 18, which are the conforming action AB7 capital projects. And unless there's somebody who really desperately needs to speak to these items, I would call for a motion on these. We have a motion. Are there any witnesses? Seeing and hearing none, call the roll.
Senator Smidian?
Aye.
Senator Fuller?
Aye.
Senator Lowenthal?
Aye.
3-0, measure is approved. For those of you who, members, I apologize. I would hope to move us out by 2:45. I know folks have schedules to keep and transportation plans. We're going to regretfully adjourn today's meeting without getting to the remaining items. We will carry those forward to the next agenda. Without objection, we're adjourned.